Hey guys, welcome to the Great Debate Community. I've been pretty excited about this debate for the last week or so. I've got Aron Ra here debating General Han Solo. Both of you, or rather everybody in the audience probably knows both of these debaters. Aron Ra is pretty prominent for his debates against creationists, and anyone in the Great Debate Community knows General Han Solo is a theistic evolutionist, and he's got a wealth of knowledge. And I thought this would be a really interesting debate because General Han Solo isn't the creationist persona that we usually see Aron Ra here taking out to the woodshed. General Han Solo is more of a theistic evolutionist, and so I started to think, okay, what topic could I bring up that would be unique and that we would see some more interesting interaction, like something that you wouldn't find in Aron Ra's other debates. And I thought, well, Aron Ra has done he's done lectures and a few brief interactions on biblical history, like the historicity of Moses, and that kind of thing. So I thought that would be a great place to start. So today we will be talking about the history of the Bible, like Genesis, the evolution of Yahweh, the historicity of Moses, the Exodus, and maybe the flood account of the Bible. So yeah, I'll just kick it over to General Han Solo, since he has kind of the positive claim, I guess, defending the Bible, and then we'll get some interaction from Aron. So hey, General, you want to get started?
No worries, thanks, Richard. And yeah, Aron, it's actually a pleasure to meet you. I'm actually a fan of yours, speaking as a Christian. I think you do a really good job in your YouTube work in regards to debunking young Earth creationism, and also a form of fundamentalism that I think that unfortunately the church has delved into. A type of anti-intellectualism that I think Christians ought to take back as an actual exercise of the scientific method. So yeah, I guess based on that, I have, as a Christian, when I look at Genesis and the flood account, the Exodus, I find it difficult to see why you would see them as myths, because from what I've looked at, there is legitimate pieces of evidence that can point towards those perspectives in a legitimate way. So the Genesis 1 account, legitimately follows an ancient Near Eastern cosmology. And then as a theistic evolutionist, I appeal to the duality of the text, where the text can be used in a modern scientific manner as well. And fast forward to the flood, I see a lot of evidence in secular journal literature where there's a Persian Gulf flooding around 40,000 years ago. The geographical in that area matches the descriptions as seen in Genesis. And then, fast forward all the way to the Exodus, and the Exodus account actually has a lot of terminologies, Egyptian terminologies, and Egyptian way of life that can only make sense in light of an 18th dynasty, the 18th kingdom. A person would have to live in that period to know all these things. So I did see your interview with DM on Is Moses Myth? Mm-hmm. And again, in light of that, I had a lot of issues with her research, because sometimes I wonder if she's actually engaged both non-Christian and, like, for example, James K. Hoffmeyer, who he's an Egyptologist, and how he accounts for certain things within the text and in Egyptian history. Yeah, so take your pick. Like, we can go Genesis 1, we can go Noah's flood, we can go the Exodus account. It's up to you.
Okay, well, you said, you know, as a Christian, you see all these, what I see is disjointed, you know, legends based on a number of unrelated floods, for example, and other things, you know, where, you know, neighboring cultures are writing about each other, and they're not terribly distant. You know, I mean, it's, and there's not like they're not haven't been trading with each other for years and years. So I mean, these aren't mystery periods. Yeah, so you have these stories that sometimes involve people that are real, or sometimes they're exaggerated, and sometimes they're made up. But at no point do they imply a god, and certainly not when you get into Genesis, for example. There's when regardless whether you're comparing Genesis 1 to Genesis 2, if you just look at Genesis 1, already it fails at the very beginning with the first verse. So at no point does any part of the Bible or Genesis or Exodus, any of it, imply a God or Jesus, and certainly none of it can be considered history. I mean, absolutely none of it can be considered history in any sense.
Okay, so let's start then with Genesis 1. What specifically about it that can you argue about it failing in a historical context?
Well, in the order that things happen, for example, in the impossible order. Now, if you're writing this as a story, if you're just, and that's all it is, you're telling it to children with the intent of giving, filling their head with a legend about how things came about. The story of Genesis, therefore, is not a lot different than when Native Americans tell the story of Coyote, you know, who put the sun in the sky and carved the river, and or he made the fish in the river. You know, all these magical things, the way they're attributed to these, you know, these intelligent agencies, because that's the only thing that primitive people could have understood, because they didn't understand any kind of scientific process. So then, when you tell the story that way, it makes sense that you have the coming dawn, for example, lighting up the sky. You have the waters, and you have the wind moving over the waters. And at this point, this was when people still thought that wind and air were spirit. And so, you know, this is why they call it the Spirit of God moving over the waters. And then as the light, at the coming dawn, you know, the light spreads. You see the mountains. Everything's an amorphous mass to begin with, slowly takes shape, and then eventually you see the plants and all this, and then you see the sun finally rise. Right. Well, this is a nice way to tell a story, a fable, legend, but this isn't history. This isn't the order in which a magical disembodied mind conjured everything with a incantation spell. I mean, this is, we can't take that literally, and there's nothing to indicate that that could be. And there was never a point. I mean, you have to look at the order of all life and everything, and it just doesn't make sense that you have whales pre-existing birds, or that you have the sun or excuse me, that you have plants pre-existing the sun in any other sense. And then, you know, the male and female created he them, right? Obviously, this is taken from like the Epic of Atrahasis. You know, this is an adaptation of that tale. You know, let us, the pantheon of pagan gods, create man in our own image. The sixth divine generation created man so that the seventh generation could rest. These are how they're put together. This is an adaptation of earlier mythology. This is not history.
No, the thing is, I actually agree with your ancient Near Eastern assessment there. Like, I don't know if you can see this photo that I'm sharing on the screen, this painting.
That's not one I've seen before. I've seen other depictions of the firmament, and I haven't seen that one.
Okay. Yeah, this is from one of my favorite ancient Near Eastern scholars, John Moulton. So it's from his commentary, where every depiction of what you see in Genesis 1. So you have the rakia, the dome. You have the temple of God up in the dome above the waters. You have the mountains. The dome has windows that, you know, the waters can come through. Here's Leviathan at the bottom, and there's pillars and so on. I completely agree that Genesis 1 is written within the scope of an ancient Near Eastern cosmology. But at the same time, I make the audacious argument that the same text, when you look at the days as epochs of time, which, and by the way, I'm not, you know, forcing any interpretation on this. It's a legitimate, a careful exercise of the nuances of the Hebrew words. as to be quite uncanny in the way it can be used in a modern sense. So when I look at it, knowing natural history, and then I compare it with the text, I actually see a perfect fit from the early conditions of the planet all the way down to humanity, roughly 100,000 years ago in the Persian Gulf region, coming out of Africa, migrating to the Persian Gulf. You did mention things like, plants before sun and so on. And I'm wondering, have you actually looked into the Hebrew scholarship that outside of science, Hebrew scholars have actually designated good arguments for the sun already existing in day one, and that the plants on day three, well, plants in this sense is very generic. So you're talking about vegetation on a new landmass that's appearing in the atmosphere, so that you have a regular cycle for the appearance of the sky on day 4.
Now,
and then obviously the Cambrian comes on day 5.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And then we have this God. Then we had the earth in this dawn vision, and as I described, in the beginning, we have the heavens and the earth is apparently the only thing in existence throughout the entire cosmos. And it takes God 4 days of tinkering and carving and whittling on this one ball of rock before he then simultaneously sneezes forth the entire rest of the cosmos, 11 trillion other galaxies, other cosmos, and then goes back to working on this planet for another couple of days. I mean, obviously the story is written from the perspective.
Sorry, could you explain that a little bit more to me?
That God created the sun and the moon, right, as if there's any equivalency to the sun and the moon, and the stars, as if there's no equivalency between the sun and the stars.
But that's the point. Does it say create there?
Yeah. Well, when did this happen? When did these come into existence according to the story? In what order? And
okay.
This was after plants already existed. He created the sun. He made 2 great lights, right? Well, that's not true, but I mean, and there's no equivalency between the 2 of them. And then he created all of the stars as if they were somehow subordinate to the sun and the moon, right? I mean, even smaller than the moon. And of course, there's a number of places in the Bible where they talk about how the stars are smaller than the moon and they have personalities and you can stomp on them when they come to the earth. Or that, like as it said in Daniel, that there might be, like a few of them could come down to wage battle with a man. I mean, there's no part of the Bible that got anything historically correct or scientifically correct. There's certainly everything it says about the Earth and its relation to the rest of the cosmos is absolutely wrong. But the way that that's wrong is important. It's wrong in exactly the same way as every other false religion that I'm sure you would accept was made up by men.
No other ancient Near Eastern text actually has the organized structure that you see in Genesis 1. You do have
no other ancient text. Okay, so the Bhagavad Gita, which is supposed to be 5,000 years old, but we know it's contextually dated to roughly 600 BC or thereabouts.
Right.
All right, so now there you have Krishna making reference to the multiverse. You have Krishna talking about that he's created the entire universe, not just this planet. So 600 BC, you have
but those are later interpolations, though.
I'm sorry.
Those are late because I'm from India, and those are later interpolations. Like Hinduism is very checkered. It's exceedingly. It's kind of like when a scribe would put a commentary on a text. That commentary then becomes the text, and then on it goes.
Well, I wouldn't argue about that because we know that happens, with every religion. But still, the Bhagavad Gita is still older than the Bible, and it makes contextual references to the Ionian Greeks and so forth. But the point is, none of these religions. I mean, you may have several of them that have this thing in common where they all believe in the Rekia that you were talking about, where they all believe in the firmament. I mean, the Persians believe this, and a number of others believe this. But the thing is that it's still wrong. So why do we take what legends the Bible has that are clearly wrong and try to make an interpretation that somehow it's metaphorically right?
Right. And that's a key word there. I wouldn't say metaphorically. I'm as a Christian, I obviously have to believe that God actually speaks, obviously
Why
to an
do you have
ancient
to believe
audience,
that?
then he has ontological existence. And through that
Well,
existence, he
why do
has
you
to...
have to believe that?
No, well, I believe it because of the evidence that's given within the text and outside the text.
Okay,
So,
let's talk about
this
the
is
evidence outside the text. Why do you have to believe that God speaks to people, and that therefore we make the assumption that the same guy who created DNA and all these other fantastic processes somehow is such a deplorably bad author that the Bible is also this same construct, and that he did it not by independently writing it, but by doing it through a whole bunch of discordant people from different religions and different perspectives and allowing their different interpretations to intercede.
right. So could I just lay out my case, if that's possible? I'll probably take like 2-3 minutes.
All right.
So the thought experiment I have is what you're seeing over here, that if you could go back in time to the Sumerians, so we could consider them to be maybe the early script in cuneiform. And the question is, could you develop a text in cuneiform that illustrates chronologically the natural history of our world, whereby you cannot alienate them with 21st century scientific terminology? You have to speak in their terms and context truths that you know. And furthermore, you must also design text to be precise enough for a 21st century audience.
Mhm.
And my argument is, in light of what's called theonoustos, the inspiration of the text, God inspired, God breathed, does the text conform to a flexibility that not only showcases an ancient Near Eastern depiction like you're seeing here, so that the people at the time are not alienated, and at the same time it communicates this picture that we currently know about? And I'm saying yes, it does.
I know that you're saying yes, it does, and I have to say no, it doesn't, because it has the Earth as being the first and biggest thing in the entire universe. So I mean, there's so many things. I mean, like every description that the Bible gives is not only wrong scientifically and historically, it's also wrong ethically and morally. There's no defense for it whatsoever. I mean,
Okay, so with that first verse, in the beginning God, now God created the heavens and the earth. Have you, now this is again my question in regards to Hebrew scholarship, have you looked into the compound noun of that phrase, heavens and earth? Because heavens and earth there are not separated words. It's kind of like saying dragonfly or butterfly. You wouldn't say there's a butter in a fly, or you wouldn't say that there are buttery flies or flies that are butter or something. It's part of the grammar to mean thing.
So in the abyss that this snow globe is supposed to be in, there is only the solid matter that we stand on, and there is the expanse of the firmament that we can dwell about in or move about in. That's where the air is. So there's the heavens and the earth.
Well, the heaven, if you wanted to translate heavens and earth accurately in our modern lingo, our modern way of speaking, we could literally say, in the beginning, which, by the way, just that one word itself, Bereshit, there's a debate on if it's independent or dependent in this clause. But in the beginning, God creates ex nihilo this universe of space-time.
Right.
And all the laws of physics that we know about.
Coyote creates, and all of these other, all these godlike characters or spirits made this happen. And the problem I have with this is the problem my son had with it when he was 5 years old. And he calls me aside and he says, "Dad, how did God just make stuff?" And that was my problem.
No, it's
too,
not.
Because
It's not so much that. The claim that you made is you already had the earth existing in verse 1, and here I'm responding to that argument and saying, look, there's a singularity start to what the Jews, to the best of their vocabulary that they would explain, is there's a singularity start to reality, that we would call the universe. And you can nuance that word down to the Planck scale and whatever if you want. But yeah, so verse 1 is completely consistent with our modern Big Bang cosmology understandings. The only difference, obviously, is the God part here.
Let me just hit this for a
That's the
moment.
only difference.
I mean, Let's see. It describes the Bible describes the Earth not as a sphere, dur, but a circle, shuk, right? In Isaiah 42.
Yep.
It's
Isaiah
divided
40.
into
Yep.
4 quadrants, sometimes mistranslated as corners, right? This is the way
But
the
it's
Bible
the Earth's
describes it.
is geometrical description in Genesis 1.
Okay. And then it's covered by this dome. And you agree that this is a common belief that everybody had in the surrounding area and that it's wrong.
Oh yeah. I'm not denying that. And just quickly on that point, the word for and I agree, Isaiah 40:22 is speaking about this flat circle. But again, this is where it gets interesting, because Job, and I'm part of the minority in saying that Job is an early text, not a late text. Job uses the same word in describing the dome. Now we know the dome, at least in the ancient Near Eastern context, the dome is spherical, or like a hemisphere. Now, but the word means a flat circle, so it makes no sense then to only translate that word as I mean, you can't think of the dome as a flat circle. So
Right.
that's the interesting nuanced interpretation, where then when you later in 700 BC after Job, so when you then take that same word and look at the Earth as a circle, you could see it as, in this case, a spherical object. But I'm not saying that word is a strong word to mean spherical, because Isaiah does use a word for ball,
Okay.
which he doesn't use
All right.
for
So
that
the
verse.
Bible describes the Earth
Yep.
incorrectly and the universe incorrectly just throughout. I mean, literally every reference it makes to the rest of the cosmos is wrong. And then it goes into the beginning of its history, which of course is adapted mythology taken over from a handful of other myths of the Sumerians and so forth. So for events that we know did not ever happen. And
Well, do you believe that?
Robert,
Do you believe that?
Robert, hold
Yeah.
on. I think Aron might have just pointed out kind of what a lot of people are thinking, like, and that's something I was thinking too when you first kind of presented this to me. Maybe you can explain how it is that you can, like, if the Bible is inspired by God, how can you get all of these mistakes, like the Earth being a flat surface and the dome? How can this ancient Near Eastern cosmology be taught in the Bible, on your view?
Because, like I suggest in this thought experiment, if you go back in time, using Doc's DeLorean, you would completely alienate the people at the time. You have to, the thought experiment, the rules of the thought experiment is that could you explain to them or write down, and by the way, writing back then is very limited, the vocabulary is very limited. It's not like you can write a 300-page monograph to, explain stuff. So you have to write in a very succinct manner. And could you write down a course of history, natural history, but obviously with a theological spin in regards to the gods, and make a polemical argument in favor of Yahweh, and simultaneously within the text keep it accurate enough for a modern century audience? So I'm saying
let me modify
that duality
question.
works.
Let me modify your question a little bit. If I were to write, if I were to write a book for these people, let's say I'm very fluent in their original language, and beyond that, I know how other cultures are going to, how the languages are going to evolve, how the cultures are going to evolve. So I can intelligently craft the wording such that the interpretation should survive through multiple translations
Exactly.
and so forth to give this.
Right.
So it would be absolutely nothing like what the Bible is, not on any aspect. I mean, not in the way that it describes the cosmos, not in the way that it describes the history, not in the way that it describes the mythology, not in the way that it gives, the unchanging and eternal methods of currency for selling male versus female slaves in terms of sheep and shekels, and all of the other nonsense that is put in here. There would be no theological spin. I could write the history and make it an accurate history and an accurate depiction of the Earth in relation to the rest of the cosmos. That would be easy to do, all too easy to do, such that people would be able to understand it across all time. But there would be no requirement of faith, and there would be no punishment of people who didn't have faith. You would not, there would be no tolerance for people being punished for whether they did or did not believe in a particular thing or a particular God. It doesn't matter what you believe. What matters is what you carry forth. You can't punish people for thought crimes, which is another one of the wrongs that the Bible does. So again, we're talking about history, right? We're talking about the Bible as history. And thus far, Genesis 1 contradicting Genesis 2, both being adapted from earlier mythology, both being based on common perceptions that we know are false, written from the perspective of people who have no idea what they're talking about, who think that the Earth is maybe an eternal plane, you know, on a flat plane for all they know, but they have no idea what the stars or anything else are. And this is because the Bible is written so badly. And then none of it actually happened, or none of the important things actually happened. I mean, you might have had a conflict at one point. Like if you're raised in India, you might have been aware of, there's a moment where Krishna, I think he counsels Arjuna to get into a wrestling match with a lake god. And then he cheats by touching the god in the hollow of the thigh, which means, you know, basically hitting him with a nut shot. And when I listen to the story from the Mahabharata, it was to me, I mean, I'm reading the exact story of Jacob wrestled, or is it Jacob? I'm having a break.
Yeah, Jacob.
Yeah, Jacob wrestling with God, except it's from the opposite perspective. And we know that these two cultures are very close together. There could have actually been a wrestling match on which both of these religions are based, but it doesn't give any credence to either of them.
That story actually you're talking about is spear that's thrust, not there's no, it's not similar to what's happening with the sinew in Genesis 32. It's totally different. I know about that mythical claim, but it's wrong.
By the way, since you were raised in India and you're familiar with the Mahabharata, I might ask you a question. Where can I find the passage that we were just talking about? Or the other passage I was curious about, that about where Krishna gives sight to the blind. I asked a Hindu couple about this. I was excited to find out they were Hindu, and I asked them, you know, can they direct me to this? And they said, we're Hindu because our parents are Hindu, not because we believe it. Which frustrated me, because that, of course, means that, you know, they're actually atheists if they don't really believe it, and they're just doing it for cultural reasons.
Just to give you a little bit of a context, I'm 29 years of age. I came out of India when I was 9 in 97.
Oh, I'm sorry. No more assumptions.
No. And I come from a British family. So the family that stayed in India, my Opa was in World War II in Burma. And yeah. But
hey, Robert, let's get back on track here.
I would like to give some positive evidence from Genesis 1 to show how it matches with science.
Okay, I still don't think we've clarified this yet. Maybe you can explain, maybe more detailed, I guess. Why is it that God couldn't communicate modern science to those in the ancient Near East? Like, is he incapable of doing that? Like Aron said, he could do it, and he could do it in a very simple way. People would read it and they would understand it. So why couldn't God do that?
I think what he did, and so now notice the focus here is Genesis 1. No other passage for now. It's only pure Genesis 1. I think he did a brilliant job in structuring the passage in such a way that the foremost concern for the people at the time is not the scientific method. The foremost concern is the which God is associated with which God, and his position of the gods. For example, Shemesh, the sun god, doesn't appear in Genesis 1. It just says the great light. If you were to suggest that, or if he wanted to borrow, quote unquote, from ancient Near Eastern understandings, he would have used the word Shemesh. Curiously, Shemesh doesn't occur in the passage, which means that the passage, that's an example where the passage wants to alienate itself from, in that text at the time. Now, in Genesis 1, like you can see here on this slide, you already have the conditions of the planet starting off in a what you can understand as a Hadean epoch. You know, it's formless and void. It's empty of life. It's totally destructive on the surface. Then it leads into a water world, and we know this through the late heavy bombardment period, where the comets will then generate at least a 1 kilometer deep ocean. And this, by the way, from peer-reviewed science journals. So like on this slide, the paper titled "The Earth's Moon System During the Late Heavy Bombardment Period." It's a 2009 paper. So the 1 kilometer deep global ocean is described in Genesis 1. Then you have landmass appearing through a pulse state, as it mentions that land grows out. 3 billion years ago, this continent ore is formed out of this watery planet. Here's a chart showing the intense increase within 1 billion years of that landmass growth. And then you have David commentating on this in Psalm 104, basically precisely giving you a rundown on, here's a primeval ocean that completely covers the globe. And then you have this tectonic activity of mountains rising and valleys sinking. And no more will the waters cover the entire planet. Because once the land masses appear...
Never did the waters cover the entire planet before, or unless you want to talk about Snowball Earth, which was never referenced in the Bible either.
Snowball Earth actually is not... because I would put Snowball Earth in day 4, roughly. Between day 3 and 4.
But it still doesn't make any difference. It's still being read as mythology, as days. It still throws species out of order. I mean, the whales are way too early. They certainly don't. Certainly don't.
The text doesn't say whales, though.
Okay, yeah, it says sea monsters.
In fact, I know this is going to trigger Aron Ra. Genesis 1:20.
Very few things will trigger me.
Well, actually, I think you'll be definitely surprised by this. In fact, I'm going to put this out there. I could be wrong, but I think this will be the first time you will hear me or hear a Christian defend bird evolution from Genesis 1. You're going to be like, what the heck?
Oh my goodness.
So I have to. So in Genesis 1 verse 20. You have now notice, Aron, this is my appeal to what I call concordism, where the text is flexible enough to be read in a modern context. So the text says in Genesis 1:20 that the waters will bring forth reptiles having life and winged creatures. In verse 21, which you might be thinking of whales, but actually tanin would be a category of like a great lizard, leviathan creature. So you can think of this as a dinosaur.
Okay.
Now,
if you're going to get into classification, let's not forget that bats are birds when they swarm when they fly, but they are also locusts when they crawl about on 4 legs and yet swarm. And so the Bible
right
by what they do, not what they
right.
are. Another one of those failures.
That's exactly, that swarming stuff is in this text of those particular creatures. Now, you have people in the 4th century, Christians like Basil, who ask the question, why do the waters give birth also to birds? And then he conjectures that there could be a family link and a common derivation from the waters between birds and fish. And you know about monophyletic pedigrees, where birds are the dinosaurs, and in turn all the way back to the Cambrian.
Mm-hmm.
So now I didn't put it in the slide because I made this a few months ago.
I have to address all this because
go ahead.
I can see how it's nicely rationalized, but I've had similar conversations with Mormons and Muslims using the same kind of apologetic, where they will state something along the lines of, like the belief that Mithras, for example, had the stars sewn into his cloak, so he would drape his cloak over the firmament to bring on the night so that you would see the stars. Well, he would stretch that out like a tent over the firmament. Well, because he says stretch it out over a tent, people interpret that to mean that this is the Quran saying that the universe is expanding. Well, this is the same kind of reverse apologetics that we're getting now.
But notice that the Quran is a 6th century document, though. The Quran comes
yeah,
much
yeah,
later than Genesis.
and the Bible is vast. It is what? It's just barely a few centuries older than that, and younger
No,
than
no.
a lot of than a lot of other things, and certainly many centuries younger than all of the things that it's based on, and all of those things are wrong. There's not been one that got it right,
Would you
except again, the Bhagavad Gita.
Could you find?
Because the Bhagavad
Could
Gita,
you find an ancient text?
Mm-hmm.
Well, here's a challenge. Could you find, and I've surveyed this, could you find, apart from Anaximander, who mentioned fish, humans come from fish, which, by the way, Hippolytus in the early church agreed with that. Why would a 4th century Christian, using Genesis 1:20, ask a question in context, know to be true?
Why would somebody do that, given a book that is riddled with quote unquote history that we know is not historic, that did not happen?
But this
whole bunch of myths
so-called non-historical book has this fact in it.
Yes, if you use the word reptile, you can use this strained interpretation to then reverse rationalize.
But he's asking the question, though.
Okay, so
Basil in the 4th century is asking this question.
Right, you have somebody else who's asking, what does this mean, or how do you interpret that? And that in no way addresses any of the failures that we've already talked about.
Well, then, I guess it comes down to, we'll have to discuss the so-called failures. But basically, I want to point out that here you have, right in Genesis 1, that then caused a lot of the commentators, and it's not just Christian commentators, but Second Temple Jewish commentators as well, basically arguing that birds find in a quote-unquote evolutionary process, ultimately from the ocean life.
Different ways that you could interpret that. Let's say that we give you that. Let's say that that is one of the many ways that that can be interpreted. All of the others which are wrong, and this one purely accidentally turns out to be right, unless somebody's basing their articles on Anaximander's work, which could be the case because he's just as old as the Bhagavad Gita. But the thing is, the Bhagavad Gita then says that the day of Brahma is 4,320,000,000 years, right?
And we know that's wrong.
What?
And we know it's wrong because we know the universe is 13.8 billion years old.
But the day of Brahma is not from the beginning. The day of Brahma is a cycle. So we have this.
Yeah, I know. And we know the universe doesn't have a cyclic action.
Yeah, exactly. But if I may get to my point.
So it's wrong. The point is it's wrong.
Yes.
General, let
your interpretation of what I have not said is wrong. We agree with that. But what I am actually saying is that in the Bhagavad Gita, 600 BC, thereabouts, comes up with this idea that the day of Brahma, which is a cyclic event, not directly related to the age of the Earth, is 4,320,000,000 years. Now, if the date had been more accurate to what the geologists and so forth have identified for the age of the Earth, that would be a much stronger argument than anything you're bringing up right now. And certainly, if the Bhagavad Gita could write that, well, then the authors of the Bible could write that, and they could have given these kinds of ages for in the beginning. 4 billion or 4.5 billion years or so ago, and we could have things like that. If you actually know the data, you would be able to describe it correctly, and you would not ever state in there or allow people to believe that if you have cattle that look at striped sticks, that will somehow psychically affect their genetics so that they will produce striped calves. You just wouldn't have that kind of misinformation in your holy book. Your book wouldn't be holy. It would be full of truth. Unfortunately, the Bible has not one word of truth in it. Nothing that is verifiably true, and a whole lot of stuff that we know is absolutely false. That's the problem with it.
Hey,
strange interpretations aside, that's really it.
Yeah. General, Aron, so I was thinking about this interpretation thing. I wonder, like, when we look at a text, there would be, I think you'd probably agree, there would be a correct way to interpret it and an incorrect way. I don't know so I don't know if we can just say like oh, there are other interpretations. I think if you're going to make this point, you would have to look at the wording and challenge that interpretation, wouldn't you? And then kind of pit it against generals.
Even if I give him the benefit of the doubt, and I were to say that, okay, that was the intended message, that doesn't say much for his God, because the authorship is still confusing. Because it's like trying to describe the events of history in a 3-stanza series of song lyrics. You know, it just can't, you can't do it that way. You've got something as voluminous as the Bible, and everything in it is either trivial and irrelevant, or it's wholly immoral and absolutely wrong. It's factually wrong. It's morally wrong. It gets everything wrong, period. And then what it praises, right? It praises the belief system, and it glorifies the belief in God, and threatens judgment over this belief, right? And that's all that matters. I mean, as he said, the way the Bible was written, and he thought it was cleverly crafted this way so that it doesn't concentrate on science, which is the thing that people should be having. Right, that they should have accurate information. Instead, it was cleverly contrived to have these people believing in make-believe things that don't produce actual good, that only cause harm.
Yeah.
So this is how the Bible is cleverly constructed, so that it does no damn good, and it just creates this huge problem forever.
Yeah, I actually liked your illustration of the 3-stanza song lyric. I wonder if we could look at Genesis almost kind of like that, because in that sense, if you were doing that, you wouldn't be troubled by errors in Genesis or ancient Near Eastern cosmology in Genesis, because that wouldn't be the intention of the author. The intention would be, in that case, in a song lyric, it would be to communicate poetry. In the book of Genesis, I think the central point would be to communicate theology, which, as General here said, would be Yahweh triumphing over the other gods. So
and not just that, but I want to also clarify. Remember, he brought up the 4 billion year cycle.
I don't want to just steamroll.
No. Yeah. I know. I just because that analogy is important, because what I'm arguing is in Genesis 1, the things that are left out is important, meaning obviously we know that things that are left out is important today, but the fact that it leaves it out is important are equally important. So Genesis 1 does not at all particular quote-unquote period of time that this takes place. It just, all you take, when you take Yom without the definite article, you're talking about periods of time.
But it doesn't describe periods of time other than days.
It does.
It gives it in days.
Again, Yom, you have to look at this in an ancient Near Eastern context. When you look at Yom,
I realize
it's
you
an
have
indefinite
to read
period
between the lines and ignore the lines.
Not at all. I'm looking at the text just the way it is.
But you're not.
Day 1
it says days, and then on third day and a fourth day, and so you're looking at what it says, ignoring what it says, and then turning it into things that it does not say. And that's another problem with the Bible, is that most of what people get out of the Bible is shit that it does not say, like that the serpent in the garden with Eve.
It doesn't say that. It doesn't mention serpent.
What?
It doesn't mention serpent.
The Bible doesn't mention a serpent.
Okay. Okay. Well, let's just General. Let's just ignore that. Let's just go with the point that he's making, because that's just like an analogy.
I just want to because I know it was left. I know it was left hanging.
I'm saying that the problem with like the whole of apologetics, I mean, any rationalization to defend the Bible at all, you can't pay attention to what the Bible actually says. You have to interpret something else into it, and that's where most of the theology comes from, right? Because like the serpent in the garden in Genesis 2 or 3, there's the common interpretation is that the serpent is supposed to be Satan.
What's the Hebrew word for serpent in Genesis 3?
I don't know Hebrew.
It's nakash.
But do we agree that it's talking about a serpent?
No. Nakash.
We don't agree that it's talking about a serpent.
This is the importance for ancient Near Eastern scholarship. Because of the lack of ancient Near Eastern scholarship that only then rose in the 1900s onwards, the word was wrongly interpreted or translated because it was taken as a mere noun. As a noun, nakash means serpent, but as an adjective, it means shining one. And and it makes sense, because we have in the garden scenario.
Why would it be shining one?
Because again, in the ancient Near East, I already showed you that photo. Let me go back to it, where you have God's cosmic. I mean, you have to think in the way they were thinking at the time. So here's God's cosmic temple. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but down here you see a little house over here with a lot of like trees and so on.
Okay.
This would be God's paradise. Now, in their thinking, God is accompanied by a pantheon of gods. And so they embody what they understood to be shininess, you know, amorphous type, you know,
So
like an appearance.
What you're saying is that that the serpent that is referenced here, that most other scholars would recognize as being an adaptation of the serpent who could not be tamed, who was the companion of Lilith.
Not at all. No.
So you're saying there's. What are you saying?
What I'm saying is you have a being in the garden that is a divine being, nothing more. It's just another. You could call him an angel if you want, like Paul says that Satan appears as an angel of light. No, the translation Nakash as a noun renders serpent, but as an adjective it means to shine.
We have the story in Genesis where we have God walking through the garden, you know, and he has his flaming sword, or flaming sax, if you like. And then you have the exact same thing brought up in Genesis, where Genesis has adapted Gilgamesh and a number of other similar myths, including Lilith and the Hulapu tree and the serpent who could not be tamed. But you're saying that none of that is true. So are you saying that regardless how you're saying it, or what justification or rationalization you're coming up with, you're saying that that was not a serpent, you're saying that was an angel, so you're saying that that was Satan, right?
I'm saying, yeah, Satan.
Okay, so Satan,
in that case, would be a fallen angel.
Satan was cursed to crawl on his belly all the rest of his days. And it's not that the word meant serpent, because that would have made sense. I mean, of course, everybody understands that angels crawl around on their bellies and eat dust and are bruised by the heels of women forever to be their enemies forever, because that's how everybody understands angels, right? Exactly the same way everybody understands snakes. But it didn't mean snake.
You know it. Okay, so can I explain that?
No, I don't think you can.
No, I would like to explain that.
Yeah, Robert, go ahead.
So the picture is you have a divine being. The word Nakash connotates the shininess as an adjective. Now, Genesis 3 has a lot of, curiously, a lot of Babylonian imagery, iconographic imagery of whenever the Apkallu, I don't know if you know about the Apkallu tradition, which in Genesis 6, the Nephilim and the sons of God, these beings are then given a type of judgment where they're cast out of the council, and to designate it towards an ancient Near Eastern audience that will be reading this sort of thing, they would understand crawling on the belly, you know, snake-like characteristics, the position of the snake in relative to humans and so on. That would be a denigrative position that makes sense in light of that context. And so, for example, in Isaiah 6, now we know the seraphim, I mean, speaking in the context of the spiritual realm, the seraphim would not take on forms of a serpent. These are immaterial beings. We don't know what form they take.
How do we know that?
But notice, because we don't know. We've never seen them. We don't know what form they take.
Know that
but
because
an ancient Near Eastern person.
All right. So let me just see how much this is wrong.
Which is
we have a word that
I haven't finished my point.
We have a word that in one context means shiny one, which of course doesn't make any sense in the story. So that's what you're going with. And then we have a word that means snake, which does match the rest of the story because it's supposed to be the cleverest of all the beasts.
I haven't finished my point though.
Okay.
Seraphim in Isaiah 6.
Robert, try to speed it up if you can.
Okay. Seraphim in Isaiah 6, you could translate it as flying fiery serpents. Now, why would it be translated that? Because, again, in an ancient Near Eastern mindset, a cobra that spits its venom is a burning, to them they would consider it as a flying fiery serpent, because a cobra has, in their understanding, wings, and you see this in Egyptian hieroglyphs, where a snake will have wings coming out of its head. The cobra spits its venom,
so the
venom can burn.
Angel of snakes.
No, these are picture languages. These are picture words
to
describe the nature of these beings.
with all of these, you know, if you substitute all these other words for other meanings and change and read between the lines, but don't read the lines, and come up with a whole different interpretation than what the Bible actually says, then you come up with a thing that would sensibly be a serpent, but is actually a shiny angel thing that has now been cursed to crawl on his belly, which I guess is only metaphorical, crawling on his belly, because the first time they bring him up
Exactly.
in Job, the first time that God and Job, or that God and Satan meet up with each other, you know, Satan is still walking, so obviously that either wasn't the character, or
Aaron, that wasn't
falling
Satan.
out. So there's no consistency there.
Job, the Satan in Job is not the devil.
Okay, and there is no actual devil in there either, because when Isaiah is complaining about, you know, Lucifer, for example, he's giving another one of those stories that you tell the children, just explaining through astrology.
Yeah, but notice why does he say Lucifer? What's the Latin word luciferius mean?
Because it's a light bringer. So we're talking about Venus, which is the morning star.
Right, and what is it related to? The Nakash, the shining one. Because as Isaiah 14 is speaking up on that theme. Ezekiel 28 is speaking up on that theme.
Isaiah is clearly complaining about Babylonian mythology, and it's not describing any Lucifer or any satanic character that fell with the 1/3 of the angels. No, that's Babylonian mythology. So there's a huge chunk of the Christian theology right there that's been blown away.
What I'm saying is, I agree with that Isaiah 14 has a Babylonian king in mind, but the language that is consistent with what I'm saying about the Nakash, 14, and then you have imagery of the Luciferius being cast to the ground. Ezekiel 28 mentions the same thing, and so on. So my interpretation is consistent with the other books of the Bible. And how
guys, I wonder if we can move on to Moses or the evolution of Yahweh. Would that be okay with you guys? Or Aron?
I want to know. Yeah, there's so much wrong with this. I mean, just absolutely every aspect of it. We could take any one finite point and labor it forever, and there's not going to be any substance out of it. There will never be any kind of history. There will only be contradictions. There will only be what Isaiah said that other people had misinterpreted, but that he never actually said. So Isaiah was never talking about, you know, this a satanic character, the devil, if you will. Neither did he ever say that this woman was going to give birth to this virgin was going to give birth to a child, and Matthew should interpret that as being fulfilled by Jesus. No, none of that happened. These are all where you have to take all the words, change all the meanings of all the words, trip your interpretations around, and metaphorically misread everything to try to come up with some justification for how no sane person would have ever written a damn thing. There's no part of this that counts as history.
If we were living at the time, this would make complete sense in such a culture.
If we were living at the time and we knew nothing and had the minds of like children and were drunk, maybe it would make sense.
Well, I don't think we can say that. I don't think we can say that.
I'm listening to you sober, and you're not making sense, and your rationalizations are not making sense.
No, I'm being consistent with the text and the historical context.
I know you think you are, but you're
not.
No,
I know I am.
Guys. That's enough of that. Let's. Okay, so we have a few more topics I want to get to. I want to do the evolution of Yahweh and Moses. I want to get to at least those two. Do you guys have a preference about what you want to do next? Aron, you have a preference?
I don't see how we could do an evolution of Yahweh. I mean, we can't even get to, I mean, one of the things that the Bible is absolutely clear on is that it's wrong about everything. And then the description of the cosmos and all of its moral guides, everything it's wrong. So we're talking about history of the Bible, right? So we're going to argue that whether the snake was an angel of cobras or whatever the hell he wants to interpret, such that it's not what the Bible actually says, so that we can pretend that it's history when no part of it is historic, even in his interpretation.
Yeah. So you don't want to do the evolution of Yahweh then?
No, I mean, we can talk about Moses.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Robert, so again, you'll have the positive case. So why don't you go ahead and let's try to practice brevity a little, Robert, because I don't want the audience to start to zone out on us. So go ahead, Robert.
Okay. I think because I didn't make an official lecture on the Exodus, and I'm actually planning on doing that soon. So what I did make in the few days that I had to prepare, I made 18 slides. Very briefly to go through.
You were supposed to prepare for this?
Yeah.
No.
I think Robert means that he's preparing a lecture on Exodus, and he's implementing what he has. Yeah.
Right. Because I already had this planned even before we even planned this discussion. And I thought, you know what, might as well just smash together a few slides for Aron if we do talk about, you know, the Exodus account. So again, this is for Aron to, I would like his response on this. So we have a memory that can only make sense if there were legitimate Israelites 1500s BC and 1400s. So all the way at start of Exodus 1, verse 8 to 10, you already have what's known as a Hyksos. Hyksos is a foreigner who comes into Egypt, and you had the Hyksos taking over the location, and so, but the Egyptians actually were able to take it back. And so you already have in Exodus 1 where you have a king, and I'll get to this word in a moment. He's unacquainted with Joseph, as we know in the ending of Genesis, you know, at the end of the book of Genesis. And then he starts speaking about how we don't want another Hyksos problem again with these new people called the Israelites. Now, I'll just skip all this. I posit that you have Amenhotep I and Thutmose I, who are the ones that you know, kill the firstborn sons and so on. Now, the fact that the word is used as king, I find very curious, and it's very important, because Pharaoh is not, and it actually comes from the Egyptian, that means great house, the Egyptian word for great house. So if you think about it, you already have a foreign group of people who don't know the name of the pharaoh, and they don't know, you know, the customs of the land and so on. So they just give a very generic title, quote unquote, pharaoh, and that actually makes sense in light of, you know, foreigners that come into our land at the time. And then secondly, you already have this phrase where Pharaoh is saying, watch the women, in this case the Hebrew women, deliver on bird stools. Now, bird stools is Egyptian word that you cannot say 2nd century BC or the 6th century BC would even know about, because again, we're talking 18th dynasty over here in regards to the bird stools. Then the very name Moses. So Moses, where, you know, in our translations it says, I drew him out of the water. Well, the name Moses is an Egyptian word, and it derives from the Egyptian verb ms over here, mus, in these names, which again only fits an 18th dynasty period. Okay. And so finally, my last point would be, and I think this is very powerful, the Shishparosh, which would be the magicians in Exodus 7. Now, if you take the Coptic look of the word Shishparosh, and you look at the hieroglyphs of, so Shish means a scribe, Per, the house, which means life, and here's the hieroglyphs. Well, guess what? It's the scribe of the house of life. That's the translation of the word. And priests in ancient Egypt were called the house of life. Now, only a person with intimate knowledge of ancient Egypt would even have an accurate statement such as that. A person living in the 6th century won't know about that.
You're saying that the Egyptian neighbors, you know, would only people who had been to Egypt or lived next door to Egypt would know about Egypt. Okay, well, I'm glad we agree that their next door neighbors knew their next door neighbors. Perfect. However, Moses, as you know from the being drawn of the water, is an adaptation of the story of Sargon, and the rest of his history is an adaptation of the story of Hammurabi. That the so-called 10 commandments, which are actually more than 10, that are in Exodus 20, 21, 22, 23. Some of these are lifted directly out of the Stela of Law by Hammurabi. So we know that the story about Moses is actually borrowed from Hammurabi, Hammurabi being from 1750 BC or thereabouts, and the period that you're talking about for Ramses, or what? No, sorry, you weren't talking about Ramses. You were talking about Akhenaten, weren't you? Or
yeah, I take.
Regardless.
Yeah, I take.
Yeah, regardless,
Yeah,
you had a different chronology than a lot of other people too, but still, we're still
I'm the early date.
We're still borrowing from Hammurabi, right? And so, and then no part of this even can be true, because the stories attributed, the greatest stories attributed to Moses are, for example, where he parts the Red Sea. So if we take the common chronology of like 1250 or so for the Ramses character, then that story is supposed to have happened 1,000 years after people were already telling that story in Egypt, but it was all, by then it was dedicated to the pharaoh Snefru and his mage Jajamak. So
yeah,
none of
I
that
actually
is original.
I actually have the original Snefru text, and the Snefru text doesn't at all depict what you do see in the Sea of Reeds type parting of the sea.
No.
In fact, the Sea of Reeds. So I mean, I've read the text because you're talking about
too. The
12
Westcar
cubits.
Papyrus, the Westcar Papyrus isn't even talking about parting the sea. It's
right.
talking about turning the water
this is not
into a blanket so that you can look under the water, lift it like a blanket, lift the water up like a blanket, and reach underneath it.
Yes.
Which is a
and guess what?
An infinitely better.
Every Egyptologist.
It's a much better trick than parting the Red Sea. So what ends up happening is you're telling a story that isn't as good as the original in the same land that the original story had already existed for 1,000 years. And so
let me.
Okay, guys, I literally walked away to go to the bathroom, and then as I walk away, I can't hear either of you because you're both talking. So let's do one at a time. Aron, I couldn't hear your last point. Maybe you could kind of briefly repeat it, then we'll get the interaction from Robert.
You want me to repeat the line?
Yeah, just what you just said, because I couldn't understand.
Everything attributed to Moses, virtually everything, is either impossible or adapted from a previous legend. So I mean, when I say impossible, I'm talking about like the Hebrew slaves, the 600,000 men on foot that are all supposed to be in that one town, and maybe that's why I keep referring to Ramses. But you know, they're supposed to be 600,000 men on foot, and then of course all their peripheral family and everything at a time when Egypt only had 3.5 million people in it. And so why didn't the Hebrews just take over the whole town? Why didn't they just walk out of there? Who's to stop them? Right? None of the story makes any sense. I mean, none of it. Not the different plagues that were supposed to be visited, nor God playing both sides of the chessboard, where he wants to have Moses perform these miracles, and then he wants to flip over to play the opposite side so that he can then harden the Pharaoh's heart. None of it. It's certainly none of it history. That's why, I mean, there was a Passover sermon by David Wolpe in 2001 where he told his congregation at the Sinai Temple in Los Angeles that according to every, or virtually every archaeologist, the way the Bible or the way the Exodus happened is not the way the Bible describes it, if it happened at all. I mean, so that's what we know.
And by the way, he recanted that claim. In 2010, he recanted.
Well, that's interesting that he would recant that when all of the other archaeologists.
No. Because no. There's a reason for that. Because, and I kid you not, UC San Diego got together 44 scholars, both secular and non-secular. One of them would be James K. Hoffmeyer. In regards to, they called it the Exodus Conference, and they showed legitimate evidence for an Exodus happening. And I've already given you very, like, the tip of the iceberg.
Okay. You can go ahead and slam me with all the ice, and I'm going to bet that there still isn't anything that constitutes evidence, because why the hell would I have been spending the last
as you can
7
see,
years of my life,
I'm saying this is recent research because James K. Hoff,
as of 2010, as I said, I spent the last 7
years. As of 2013, actually.
Okay,
James K. Hoff.
You said
James K. Hoffman.
You said the evidence was in 2010. Now you say it's in 2013.
No.
How could the evidence in 2013 have changed somebody's mind in 2010?
Okay, Richard, can there be moderation here, please?
Let's both of you guys just stop talking over each other. Robert, let's get your response, then some interaction. So go ahead.
James K. Hoffmeyer wrote a book which I highly recommend for you to get and read. It's called Israel and Egypt. He published it in 1990. started his work in 95 and makes the point, and it's a legitimate point, when you look at Kenneth Kitchen, James K. Hoffman, all those Egyptologists. Egyptology started actually from a biblical context, specifically from Exodus. Unfortunately, there came a divide where the science of Egyptology was then removed from any form of Exodus research. So therefore, we're talking practically all of the 20th century. The Exodus story was, shoved to the shelf while they just did their archaeological research in Egypt alone. Only in the 90s did a serious undertaking happen in regards to the Exodus account. And so James K. Hoffmeyer, being an Egyptologist, wrote a book saying in the last 10 years, they started to account for all these remarkable accuracies that you see in the text. Now, relatively early at the time, because don't forget, this stuff wasn't actually accounted for right throughout the 20th century. Then from 99 onwards, and because James K. Hoffmeyer's work was the first attempt to account for this stuff. And so 13 years later, so up until 2010, where Volpe then recounts his claim, and then finally in 2013, they actually had an Exodus conference in UC San Diego showcasing practically 80% of the things that you see in the text is accountable, you can account for in historical research.
So why is it that in the last few years, let's say the last 4 years, that any number of people that I talk to, any number of archaeologists, so forth, will all say that there's absolutely no evidence, and it is now a consensus position that Moses never existed?
Well, give me a name.
Okay. When I ask for the evidence that changed these people's mind.
Yeah, give me, for example, Finkelstein. He would agree with me. He used to be a huge critic.
I don't know who Finkelstein is off the top of my head, but I'm asking for that evidence. And I want to know why it is that all of these other people seem to be commonly broadcasting that there is no such evidence. Well, if there is evidence, how come nobody knows about it?
Okay,
how come I don't know about it?
So
let me find out what that evidence is.
Yeah, Robert, and when you do this, the audience is saying you're getting really caught up in the minutia. So just try to lay out the case, and then you can get into details as you
here's in a summary statement. Here's a map with the latest that they know so far. Graphical depictions given in the text. Now, see where my mouse is, where you have Migdol. Now, Migdol in Exodus 14, the Israelites are trapped, and then you know the story that the water parts ways, and they've now found that the Sea of Reeds is within this location. All right, so they cross over here. Now, so what does this mean? It means that this water has to transition northward somehow for them to cross over. Well, you have a geophysicist, and he's not a Christian. So let me bring up his calculation here.
So is there any kind of peer-reviewed citation you can give me? That
Yes. This is legitimate. This was done as a PhD. This is a PhD work, and his work was then used to accommodate certain tsunami effects that you will see in the Philippines.
Okay, so if there is evidence, so that all these people that I know that say that there is no evidence of the Exodus, and have been saying for the longest time that there is no evidence, you have this evidence, and it's in the form of a peer-reviewed citation you can give me now.
Oh, no, well, actually, I'm uploading it on my channel right now. It's over 24 hours long. It's an entire conference.
It hasn't been peer-reviewed, but it's available on your channel.
It's been in fact, the entire conference was put into a monograph, and I can get that monograph for you if you want. It's published in 2015. It's very recent.
So very recent. There is evidence of the Exodus.
Yes.
It was published 2 years ago, and somehow nobody knows about it, but you're going to give me that citation now.
Yes.
Okay, what is that citation?
So it's Israel's Exodus in Transdisciplinary Perspective by Thomas Levy.
Israel Exodus what?
Actually, can I?
Yeah, do you have the
link inside?
Yeah, if you have the link, I'm going to share it with the live chat too.
There's the link. This is the compilation of that conference. And in that conference, you have Stephen Ward, which I don't know if you can see what I'm sharing now. It's a video. Let me just put this on.
Robert, why don't you just kind of move forward to the argument?
I still
Okay,
want
can you see this? Is this working?
Yep.
Is it in the chat somewhere?
Oh yeah, it's in the side chat, Aron.
Oh, for this hangout. Okay.
Yeah, for the hangout. Yep.
All right, thank you.
Yeah. Richard, can you present me?
Okay. All right, you're up.
Now, I'd be happy to read this, but before we go on, I had mentioned before about the 600,000 Hebrew men on foot, right?
Yes.
Okay. And that Ramses is roughly a 2-week walk from Canaan, especially if you follow the coastline. Right. And there would be nobody to stop 600,000, which would account to, if you add on the, the women and the old people and everything, that would be like 2 million people. So as I've said so many times, if they started out walking for Canaan and they started out single file, each man 1 meter ahead of the next, which is a reasonable distance to walk, then the first people would get to Canaan before the last ones left, because it's not that far away and would take only 2 weeks to get there. It's 250 kilometers, I think it is. And so we don't get any justification for 40 years of wandering in the desert, just like we don't get any justification for anything the Bible.
And so do you know how that just totally can be totally thrown into the trash bin? The 600,000 is actually 2 words. One word for 600 and the other word aleph, which means 1,000. And when you join it, you get 600,000. Guess what? In Egyptology studies, aleph can mean clan. And if you then translate it as clan, 600 clans, now you're talking about at most 2,000 people, not even.
Okay, so if we have just changed all the meanings of all the words.
No. We're being precise and consistent with the language.
The author is not. Because look how everything is
because you're reading an old King James translation. That's what you're doing. I'm accounting for the latest in Hebrew scholarship and Egyptology scholarship. So it makes complete sense then for a clan. And by the way, Hyksos, the whole Hyksos period.
You might be able to find justification for some group of foreigners being in Egypt, and maybe if it's only a couple of thousand, some group of foreigners leaving Egypt. But that doesn't give any justification for the historicity of the Bible. I mean, while we're talking about Egypt, for example, where was this 40-year period that was supposed to have happened under the...
All right, so the 40-year period, the 40-year period, very clearly in Numbers 7, it mentions that they weren't lost. It's not that they were... What?
That's not the 40-year period I'm talking about. I was saying that when, what was it, Ezekiel said that, oh God, what was his name?
You're saying they were walking around for 40 years and they could have gone in a few weeks.
No, I was talking about a different thing, but I just can't remember what his name was. It was a conqueror that was supposed to have taken over. He was supposed to have taken over the city of Tyre, but he failed there. He was also supposed to have taken over Egypt and wiped out all of it. It was supposed to have happened during his reign, so that there was not one man nor beast that was walking in Egypt. And this was the prophecy.
Yeah, that's Ezekiel 28. Yeah.
And this is where the prophet had also admitted in that prophecy that he had failed the previous.
That's entirely different. That's not the Exodus account.
I understand that, of course, that it's not the.
So
Exodus
I'm wanting to get to my point here.
Okay.
I'm wanting to show
I'll
you.
Be quiet and let you make all the points you think you can. But
Aron, I think this is so your point is that there might be a group of foreigners who left Egypt, but I think what Robert is trying to present, it'll show that they were able to cross the Sea of Reeds on foot because the water subsided according to whatever scientific.
And if there was a group of foreigners who crossed a Sea of Reeds on foot, so.
It matches with the story. There's nothing wrong with the story. Okay, so you can't say that the story is mythical.
Let's just give you that. Let's say that there's a group of foreigners that left Egypt, that walked across. Let's say that somehow or other their story is the one that ends up being remembered, even though we don't have a mention of Moses until about 250 BC. But let's say that that's what ended up happening. Right, that this group of people, that we have this integration with Hammurabi and Sneferu and all of these others integrated, and now we have these group of people that walks out that becomes another element that was added into the Exodus story. So still not historical, Still not indicative of a God. And we still have where the Bible fails in every imaginable way due to poor authorship or obvious non-involvement of any deity.
Can I just finish with this actual physics simulation from Stephen Ward, who is not a Christian,
go ahead.
and actually defends the sea of reeds passing?
Yeah. Yep. Go ahead.
Okay. So if you can present me, so that there's no so it actually appears for everyone. All right. So here's he denotes at least 80 knots of wind, and now at the top here, the clock. You're speaking about hours, so around 5 hours into the wind direction, you'll actually see the sea parting away. And now notice where they'll be crossing. The Sea of Reeds is over here. See where my mouse is? I don't know if you can actually see my mouse, but where you start to see red locations and so on, this is where they start to cross, and then they pass through, and then they come onto this side, and then continue on into the wilderness wandering. Now notice what happens. The wind will then subside, and now you'll have the tsunami effect where the waters come back crashing in, and then the chariots and all will be drowned. Legitimate physical animation that was then, it was sparked into a PhD thesis where this type of phenomena is accounted for in the Philippines and basically in the Indian Ocean, and because of wind patterns and so on.
Okay, so you're now saying that it wasn't a miraculous parting of the sea, it wasn't an adaptation by Snefru, and again, it's an adapted element of the story with there's no miracle, and it's still not indicative of a God, and even if that event happened, it still wouldn't make the Bible historic.
Well, the real miracle here is that these people knew when to leave at the right time and where to go at the right time to account for these natural phenomena.
I think if they hadn't left at the right time, then their story would have been forgotten, just like everybody else's story was forgotten, and that these are the only people we remember.
So they survived it
because they're the only ones out of all the people that made through that ended up having a memorable tale, because that's what we remember, the ones that had the unfortunate circumstances or the interesting details. So
Aron,
and this has been going on for thousands of years. So again, how many other people had failed before we have this one group that makes it, even assuming that that's what actually happened?
It's a unique story that you won't find anywhere else.
Okay. So there's a unique story that you won't find anywhere else.
And it fits with all the logical data that we know so far.
And that it also does not support the Bible as a historic document, because we're still talking about integrated stories with people whose lives are obviously based on the elements of other people and obvious things that didn't happen and descriptions that are wrong, as I said, not just scientifically but also morally and so forth, so that there's no indication of a God, certainly no indication of a Christian God, and that the Bible remains not remotely biblical, even if there are elements in it. And I told you in the early set that there would be elements of the story that might have actually happened, that there might have been real characters involved, but that it still doesn't make it a historic document.
Even down to the parting of the sea, if that was proven to you, then how would you see
if
the
you
Bible
prove to me that one of the things in the Bible happened, but not in a miraculous way, and not in a way that matches the theology either, I'm not going to have a problem with that. I would expect that some of the things in the Bible are based on real events. And I mentioned a couple of those examples earlier, but that doesn't show that the Bible is a historic document, especially not when you get into the New Testament. And it doesn't matter. The prophecies are failing.
Okay, but if that's the case, if it's a purely human work, especially with grand things like what you're saying over here.
Which it clearly is.
No, and by the way, I'm not disagreeing. It is a human work.
Okay.
But there's key strategic moments in human history, in this case particularly about the Jewish race, heard of in any other ancient Near Eastern context, and yet their stories maintain an accurate archaeological resurfacing.
Isn't the Hyksos just a limited group of I'm pulling on ancient memory here because it's been so long since I read about it.
You're talking.
But aren't they like a barbaric nomad group even within the Canaanites and so forth? Okay, right. So we're not even talking about Israelis.
No, but they not in Canaanite. They weren't in Canaan.
Okay, well, like I said, it's been too long since I read about the Hyksos.
Yeah.
I mean, I could have taken you to the. Let me stop sharing this. I could have taken you to the stela that actually has the name Israel in it, dating to the 14th and 15th century BC.
Okay.
Egyptian. Here's the Hebrew. I mean, sorry, not the Egyptian for Israel.
Okay.
Now, why would this appear in an Egyptian stela?
Because they were neighbors.
No, the word Israel itself. Because remember, the Murdoch said that Israel didn't even exist. The word Israel doesn't exist. There's no such thing as Moses and so on.
Okay.
And I've already shown you here that the name itself is completely consistent with.
Okay, so the name Israel existed when she didn't think that it did.
Yeah, she said there's no such thing as Israel. It's a very late invention.
Okay, and there was a couple of other things that I'd seen claimed that were later corrected, like one of the original archaeologists thinking that Nazareth, for example, didn't exist at the time of Jesus, and that they had since found artifacts from that period.
Right.
I don't have a problem with that. Okay, what I have a problem with is that the Bible gives these descriptions that we know are wrong. The flood never happened. We know the Tower of Babel didn't happen. We know these things didn't happen. We know what really happened.
But I can show you the flood did happen, and here's the flood.
That was, hold on, Robert, hold on. Aron, that was actually my next question. I don't know how much time you have. I would like to go into the flood if you have time for it. If not, then.
Yeah, I don't mind. I can jump into the flood.
Okay. I know that Aron. Okay, can I ask Aron this question? Aron, am I the most interesting Christian you've come across? Because that would just be, if you say yes, then that would be awesome, because obviously I'm your fan. So
I don't know how to answer that question.
Okay,
I'll be charitable and say that you're. No, I can't say that you're the most interesting, because you are not the absolute most freak show person I've ever run across. I have.
That's a compliment. Not the most.
I appreciate it.
It is. You are. It's definitely a compliment to say that you are not the most interesting Christian. Because the most interesting Christians are the ones that you just wouldn't believe. Like the most interesting Christian that I've ever encountered, I interviewed recently, and he was the one that he decided that he's read the Bible, and that's all he's read. He hasn't read any of the peripheral history. He's done none of the sources of biblical history. He hasn't taken any classes in comparative religion or comparative mythology. He hasn't done any of the research that I've done, and there's some people in your chat room don't think I've done any, but yes, I have. But this guy had come away with just reading the Bible himself, and so he's decided that the serpent was Adam, or that Adam was the serpent. That's his.
Yeah, I know that theory. Yeah, that's a crappy theory. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that I thought was interesting. Why? Because he came up with it himself and decided that absolutely every scholar who knows anything better than him is wrong.
He got it from Sitchin. Sitchin was the one that promoted it. Yeah, I know you. I'm sure you know about Zachariah Sitchin.
Right? That it was his own original interpretation.
No, because I looked into that and I tried to find what the early source was, and Zachariah Sitchin and his stupid ancient alien stuff.
Yeah, and that was the problem that I had. That's part of the reason that I am the way I am now. Is when I was 12 years old, somebody gives me a book on it was
the 12th planet,
Chariots of the Gods.
Yeah,
right, with the Nazca lines and all that, and I was expected to just believe whatever I was told. And this is one of those examples.
Yeah. And that's understandable, Aron. I actually sympathize with your knee-jerk reaction. Like now, I'm not.
I don't think
I would never a
knee-jerk reaction.
Yeah, I was going to say I don't think you would describe it like that.
Well, okay, I'll take that back. I meant a form of skepticism that is healthy, but at the same time, because of the rubbish that's been presented, for too long now, Ken Ham and the Ark and. I mean, to Christians like me who actually care about the content and actually do the peer review material research, I'm actually the small voice in this, and that's unfortunate. I'm actually the small voice.
No, but I still, you understand that we still have the same problem that we had at the beginning of this, and it's surprising when I look at the chat room. And somebody says, the general is crushing Aron. Aron is getting schooled. You're not telling me anything that other Christians haven't already told me, except for the reference that, you have evidence of Exodus. But then that evidence turns out to be the Sea of Reeds, which I already knew about, and which didn't have any impact on this. So I don't see how I'm getting schooled.
Yeah, Aron, don't worry about the chat room. People say all sorts of things in there.
Yeah.
You'll have people on one side and people on the other, so I wouldn't worry about it.
Yeah. Well, like I have so many issues with this. I mean, if the Bible were to be historic, it wouldn't be a collection of different mythologies mixed with a handful of different things that may or may not have actually happened, or stories relating to people that, you know, that some of the names and some of the places actually existed. And so if somebody finds, you know, if they say they found archaeological evidence of what they believe to be Sodom, for example, that's supposed to prove the Bible, but then they also found Troy, right? That doesn't prove Odin, or excuse me, why did I say Odin? Zeus, you know? So
Right.
then there's problems with the theology. There's problems with the failure of the prophecies. There's problems with the way the Bible describes the cosmos, as we went over, right? And then that doesn't even get into the theology of it. Like, why would the Bible have written any of this? What's the purpose of Jesus's sacrifice? I mean, none of that makes any sense. I mean, absolutely none of it.
Yeah, but these are good questions, and I wish I could get into them, honestly.
Robert, hold on. Before we go into the flood, Aron, there's something I'd like to ask you, and I asked this to a lot of atheists I encounter here on the GDC. Let's suppose your first encounter with Christianity was more moderate, like it wasn't fundamentalist. Do you think if that were the case, you would be where you are today? You would be an atheist activist, or what do you think?
I think I can answer the question, you know, pretty easily. I didn't experience fundamentalism to what I'm experiencing now, you know, with the Texas fundamentalists, with the Dominionists and so forth. Everybody was relatively moderate. I will have to say that I was the only non-creationist that I ever knew until I was 14 years old. But I didn't, even though everybody I knew throughout my childhood was a creationist, I mean, absolutely everybody, I didn't meet the fundamentalist types, the extreme barking crazy weirdos that now run our government until 20 years ago. I had somehow been blissfully unaware of them. And I thought that all of the arguments for Christianity, apart from the biblical literalism, you know, I thought that they were all reasoned somehow. But then when you sit down and talk to them, it just doesn't work out that way.
Yeah. Okay. So Robert, let's start with the flood. And again, I want to tell you, just be brief, so we can, because this is an interaction, not like a
right.
Go ahead.
The problem, Aron, is I actually I'm a student. I'm doing a master's in physics and engineering, and I've been put into the tutorial class where I teach the lecture notes and so on, and it's hard for me to be brief. But basically, in a nutshell, I gave a 2-hour talk on this on my channel. I advise you check it out. Based on actual geophysical evidence of not only the timing of the humans in the Persian Gulf. So this is during the Pleistocene and Holocene period, 50,000 years ago, where from out of Africa they migrate into this region. In this talk, I labeled that the Garden of Eden is located around there, where my mouse is located. And then around 13,000 years ago, you have a sudden flooding, and that was only recently formulated in a 2015 paper, where the extent of the flooding would have been this size that you're seeing here in the middle. And today's, Persian Gulf is what you're seeing today.
Yeah, and I did.
If Noah
is aggressive, and I'm sure that means something. And there was some other floods. There were some other floods that had profound effect too, but they were all.
But this was a sudden, huge flooding, is what I'm saying. Within a year, the paper even went as far as to say how long it took.
Yeah, I was following what I did a series of videos disproving Noah's flood. I think it ended up being 8 episodes or so. And in the last couple of them, I talk about the flood of Kish and Shuruppak in 2900 BCE, and how these are reflected in the subsequent tales of Utnapishtim and Gilgamesh and Ziusudra and so forth. And these are where we get the Noah character. So it's not from 13,000 years ago. It's it's half that.
Oh, well, no. I agree with that. In fact, I would actually go as far as to say that we need the Mesopotamian. So, for example, on this slide, I need the Mesopotamian material to account for a shared memory, because we both know, appear like 6,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago, because obviously the writing material dates even much later, like 3,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago. But we know humans come out of Africa 100,000 years ago, and so the humans within this region here experienced a flooding in this region 13,000 years ago. And so that shared memory, and that's another thing. Notice that my mouse is going to the utmost point just below the Armenian mountains. And now Aron, I think I want you to pay attention here, because Ken Ham and all the young creationists will say, oh, you need a global flood because of Mount Ararat. Now, curiously, in the Mesopotamian literature, see where the floodwaters meet at an end up here. Now, at the end up here, you have a mountain called Mount Judy, or Urartu is the Mesopotamian equivalent. Well, Urartu actually accounts for what the Hebrew originally had in Genesis 8:4. So usually translations will have things like Ararat, but because of scholarship like what you see here in by Edward Lipinski, he's an ancient Near Eastern scholar. Hang on a second. If you place Hurarat, because of the Dead Sea Scrolls, it corrects the word. Guess what? The ark doesn't land up in Mount Ararat. It's much further south, which is this red circle down here, which matches the Mesopotamian understandings of when the ark landed. And so basically, geographically, it fits the geophysics of it. Because if
time period.
No, not at all, because we have a shared memory.
It's not 2900 BC. It's not the names of the characters in the towns where it happened. It's not followed by the archaeological evidence that matches, that all imply that it should be 2900 BCE and not 13,000 years ago.
No, the text doesn't give you a date. No Mesopotamian material gives you a date as to when it happened.
Right, I understand that. There's
only Genesis gives you the months and maybe the year, but right. It doesn't.
And then we know that those are taking several different details from the other myths that I just mentioned, which all emanated from 2900 BCE and not from 13,000 years ago.
The point is this: Genesis 2 gives you a geographical location for Eden. Eden, with the 4 rivers, is mentioned in our investigation in the natural sciences to be in the Persian Gulf. We then know that there was a flooding, a huge flooding, that happened in the low-lying region of this Persian Gulf. Obviously, the ark, the water would be coming in this direction into the Persian Gulf. So, according to the text, say that it lands in Urartu. Urartu is exactly where the utmost point that this water would reach up to at its largest extent.
Are you saying that it's irrelevant that all of the details from Utnapishtim and Ziusudra and Atrahasis are all implied?
No, I'm not saying it's irrelevant. In fact, I tell Christians this. If I was to call out to Noah, let's just say, if I was to say, hey, Noah, he would know who I'm talking to. But if I was to say Utnapishtim, then we turn around and say, yeah, well, what do you want?
Okay, so why are we still then talking about 13,000 years ago?
Because because based on our calculations, this massive flooding happened at the end of the Pleistocene and the start of the Holocene.
Okay, so but then we lose the textual references that all come from 2900 BC.
No, the textual references are written down and recorded for the first time 2900 BC.
Based on events that are archaeologically also confirmed for 2900 BCE.
Sorry?
For the flood they detected, that geologists and archaeologists detected that there was a flood of Shirapok and Kish of a particular magnitude.
Right. Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, but not to the scale though.
Not to that scale, but this lesser scale flood in 2900 BC is the one that begat the Utnapishtim, Ziusudra, Atrahasis, which then was translated into Noah because he takes all those details.
No, I know about that, and that's not the case.
There were many greater floods. Well, there were many greater floods than the one in Shirapok and Kish. That one, the flood of Shirapok, is the one that gave us the Noah legend that we now have in Exodus. There was a much better one for the Sea of Galilee 15,000 years ago, and another one for the flooding of the Black Sea, which is way more dramatic than that, which was 8,000 years ago. But these did not produce the flood legend that we have in the Bible.
No. So the clear refutation of what you just said in regards to the the 2900 BC date, and because of that, then they wrote down that literature. You have to look into what's known as the Apkallu tradition. We're talking about memories that go much further back. We're talking 7,000 years plus.
We're also talking about names.
Exactly.
Names and archaeological
Exactly.
references, dividing the end of the Genova period. So we can show exactly when the flood occurred and correlate it to the names and dates that are associated with that, so that we know when it happened, and we know that it wasn't 13,000 years ago.
But notice the slide I'm showing you here. In this slide, now in the Wellhausen hypothesis, the claim is Genesis is written 6th century BC. We know about this Kuwait River, which is the Pishon River mentioned in Genesis 2. It dried up in the 3rd millennium BC. This is before.
How do you know that Genesis was written in 6th century BC?
This is those who say that the Genesis text is composed in the 6th century BC. So I'm using the claim, and I'm asking the question: how did the Yahwists know about the Kuwait River that dried up in the late 3rd millennium BC? The fact that it's mentioned in the text, the Pishon River as flowing, is already speaking about a shared memory that pre-exists any of the other Mesopotamian literature.
Okay, again, that's consistent with what I was saying, and not so much with what you're saying. So
no, it's not, because this is stuff before 2900 BC.
3rd millennium BC.
Right, before. So it's flowing, the river's flowing, well into the Pleistocene, and then obviously then you have the flood, and then it dries up, because the Havilah Mountains, as you see down here, they produce the river that goes into this location where the Garden of Eden is located.
Okay, so we accept then at least that evolution happened. The universe, the Earth is not flat. That it's not covered by a giant crystal dome. It was never the first thing in the universe. It was never the only thing in the universe. The global flood didn't happen. And whether you think that there's contributing factors by other floods, I agree that there's contributing factors by other floods. I said that in my flood series, but that the specific one that we're getting from Genesis is adapted from the one that's named Ziusudra and all of this, and that there's so many parallels between these three characters, which are actually the same original character, that we can't be talking about 13,000 years ago, even if there's also mentions of things from 13,000 years ago. So we agree on all that. So we agree that if there was, if all these other people had come in and out of Egypt, and they didn't happen to make these fortuitous circumstances, well, their stories were forgotten because they didn't really have a story. And so you have this one group that goes through and they do get a story, and then that story is mixed with a whole bunch of other stuff that never happened or was taken from somebody else, taken from Hammurabi or Snefru or whatever. So that ultimately we end up with the Bible not being historic.
Absolutely no. I agree with I agree with everything you said about evolution, science, and so on. And I'm arguing.
You agree with all the reasons that the Bible can't be considered history.
No, it's considered history.
Yeah. So I wonder if we can. I think we might have sidestepped a pretty important issue here. Aron, would you say that we're talking about the flood? Would you say that the Bible teaches this global flood?
The Bible definitely teaches a global flood, yes, and it gives a moral to the story, which is reprehensible.
Yeah. So yeah.
Where does the Bible teach
that the Bible teaches that Moses is the one good and righteous man? This is the naked old drunk cursing his own kids. He's the only person worthy to be saved. Just like when they destroyed Sodom, right? And he allows Lot to be the only survivor. The guy who gave his daughters to a rape mob. Because they're only girls, they're not valuable, right? So the Bible teaches also that Abraham, Abraham ends up having dinner with God, and it's not Jesus now, it's God. While the two angels go down to go visit Lot, and they're apparently gay angels because or maybe that's the gay that the town thinks are really cute. So he decides that he's going to. But in this Lot now. The rape mob doesn't want his daughters, so he ends up molesting his daughters himself. He gets drunk and molests his daughters himself, and then blames them for getting him drunk. And this is the only guy righteous enough to be saved. I mean,
but then his entire family history becomes the
What
Moabites, and they
staggers
become
me-
the worst people.
Yeah, yeah. What staggers me is how you read this, and you come away believing there's any truth to it at all.
Because there is. I've just been showing you. I've been showing you the
You've
material.
been showing me how there's little elements that could have been blended
Not
into this
little.
mixer full of nonsense, but which do not justify any of the theology. I mean, you started out saying that you're a Christian. Well, how could you possibly be Christian knowing what you do? I mean, why would you believe this anyway?
Because I consider it to be consistent with what I
Well, it
understand
obviously
by the
can't
scientific
be.
method.
I mean, it obviously can't be that you have to believe in Jesus in order to be saved, right? That doesn't make any sense. Why would you have to why would you have to believe in Jesus? To be saved from what?
Actually, the New Testament context is all about having theosis. So my hope is that I can finally experience theosis and be with the Creator.
So what about the people who don't have theosis, the people who just can't believe genie-like being who's judging you for what you believe?
Well, I think the Bible actually accounts for such people, that they could in fact be joined in that theosis as well. They may not
Okay, so how
give
do we
off
get out
faith
of that?
time.
How do we avoid that?
The only way to avoid that is if Jesus did not come and do what he did.
Okay, so there's no way to avoid being with your God.
Yes.
Wow. Okay, because I remember a prayer.
Well,
that I gave.
you too as well. You will experience theosis, and
No,
you will
I
see
will not.
Jesus.
Let him finish.
I will call you out for making an assertion that is unsupported by fact. I offered a prayer when I was 12, and I started reading the Bible, and I thought, this is the most repugnant, barbaric, superstitious silliness I've ever read, and it is wholly immoral. And I challenged God in prayer to either explain how he could be associated with all of this evil, or justify it by saying that by convincing me that the Bible got him all wrong. And I can say that prayer was answered because the Bible is all wrong. Even if there was a God, that wasn't correct. But in my prayer, I said, okay, it would have to be one of these conditions, because if you did neither, then he cannot have my soul. And I still, at 12 years old, believed in hell at that time and understood that I was damning myself. But in that prayer, I said, can't I just die like everything else does, like you're supposed to, because that's the way it should be? So why do we not have that option?
I think that's ultimately a hopeless end, a very depressing end.
No, it's not.
So it is, because it's the whole notion of chaos kampf, a struggle against chaos, and the only way.
Eternal damnation.
One second. So the only way that overridden, if a God exists, is if he comes in under kenosis, meaning he empties himself and he joins with the creation and calls theosis. Theosis is just another way of saying deification. He deifies the creation so that we can then have a new existence for eternity.
So do you believe in hell?
Yeah, but I have not your typical Christian views of on hell.
Okay, so regardless, we still have this dichotomy where you're either get the impossible promise of the eternal reward, which actually would be a form of damnation in itself. Those are for those who believe, and for those who are not gullible enough to believe without evidence, then you will experience the damnation, the threat of a fate worse than death. You have to believe what the priests are selling you, or you get the stick or the carrot. There's the choices.
I don't see that at all in Scripture. I see
that's probably
it
why
as
you're Christian. I can't. I mean, I was Christian myself only until I started looking at it, and I just couldn't buy any of it anymore. I mean, there wouldn't be any damnation. There would be no requirement of faith, which is, of course, the absolute failure of the whole thing. The fact that you have to believe X in order to be saved, that's so repugnant in and of itself. Now, going into oblivion, and having your life mean something for as long as you exist, and then you don't exist anymore, that's fine. We're all good with that. We should be. We didn't exist before we were born. There wasn't a problem with that. So I don't have a problem with being dead and being really, really dead. But the whole thing.
Yeah, but that idea.
Any
I mean,
version.
Robert, hold on, Robert.
Okay.
Any version of an eternity after that is a form of damnation, especially if I'm going to have to spend that eternity in the company of little Anthony Fremont from Twilight Zone.
Hey,
Yeah.
Aron, so your debate with when you're partnering with Atheist Edge tomorrow, I think I know I will be there, and I think General will too. So I think we can talk more about those theological issues then. Right now, I wonder if we have any more ground to cover on Noah's flood or.
I don't think we do. I mean, it seems that he and I agree, and I'm sorry to say that, you know, I was open to the idea that he had the evidence that I hadn't heard of, but then I realized that I had heard what he's talking about, so never mind, it doesn't matter. Strangely, this is going to be the case. It's kind of like what so many of the creationists, the young earth creationists, argue when they say we're both looking at the same evidence, coming to different conclusions. We are actually both we're accepting of all the same facts.
Yeah.
It's just somehow he's derived an interpretation that is, for me, impossible.
Do you mean like
Well,
an interpretation of Genesis 6? Like
and he knows that the Bible is every kind of mythology and ancient legend and a couple of smatterings of actual people run in through a blender so that everybody's life comes from 4 different people, right, including Jesus himself. And somehow or other, all of this human manufactured man-made mythology he takes as historic, if any portion of it was based on somebody that might have actually lived. That somehow justifies all the bits that we know are not true or exaggerations. You know, like we're supposed to believe the Tower of Babel.
Yeah, but you're making these claims without, and I this is not meant to be a rude statement, but I legitimately believe you haven't actually looked at the nitty-gritty details that I've had to go through in order to then faithfully and honestly
why don't
say,
you give me a nitty-gritty detail that implies, but
it's not Aron Ra, it's not just one nitty-gritty. We're talking about one word can speak about 10 pages length of explanation.
Hey, General, so he just challenged your methodology, like he struck against it, the whole concordism thing, like and I think that, like Steve McRae, he said in the live chat that he agrees, and I wonder if we can circle back to this, and then I guess we'll start to close it out.
It's a homework problem, in my opinion.
Okay.
I've actually done the reading, and I'm making that claim. It is a challenge. I hope to be proven wrong, and I don't think that Aron Ra or even Steve McRae, even though I love Steve McRae, I don't think they've actually looked at the text the way I've looked at it with an exhaustive method.
I can guarantee I haven't looked at the text the way you've looked at it, even when we make the concession.
No. When I said the way I've looked, I'm talking about exhaustive research. Like you've actually hammered out. Should be understood.
I have dedicated a really unhealthy amount of my life to this, but I wouldn't say that I've done exhaustive research even then. You know, I mean, for one thing, I mean, I know people that have learned Hebrew just so they can read the Bible, and this is before they become atheist, which, you know, is encouraging to me that everybody I know that's gone through all of this has come out that way. And I'm glad that you don't accept the creationism thing. I don't understand how, as I said, we have the same information, and you just have a different interpretation of it. And if we explore this any further, I honestly don't. And I could be as open-minded as I want to be, but at no point will you be able to.
Okay, Aron, I got the solution for this. Is it possible? And this would be great if you could. Like, obviously, I know you're busy and so on. But is it possible, if you can, on your channel, review my Noah's Flood lecture?
You said it's 2 hours.
that's a good
I know, but that's what I'm talking about. It took me 2 hours to even explain my position. So if you can, that would be great.
I think we've been on this for 2 hours, and you haven't told me anything relevant.
Well, obviously, I had to respond to what you're saying. Obviously, I can't like make a lot of points in our discussion.
Come up with something relevant or material, and maybe tomorrow you can tell me something that would actually evoke me to change my mind. I don't think that's possible. And I think the reason that I don't think that's possible is because, as I said, you are not the most interesting Christian I've ever talked to. I've been debating Christians constantly and continuously for over 20 years. I'll let you know when I hear a new argument.
But you haven't debated a Christian like me, that's for sure.
When did I not? I mean, okay, I'm sorry. I've been debating a lot of crazies. Yes, that's true, but that doesn't mean that everybody I've ever talked to was a nut job. Okay, they still come up with a series of interpretations or assumptions that are unwarranted by the data. And the belief in a God, or the claim that the Bible is historic, or historic in the fact that in the sense that it is a history, that's completely unjustified.
It is justified. I already showed you the Egyptian etymological words. I've already showed you.
You were unable to show that justification.
Okay, let me summarize my arguments that we've done so far. So
I don't think. Well, okay. I guess if we're
I
going to
don't
do
need
that,
to hear another summary of your
yeah,
arguments.
yeah. I mean,
you can talk about the irrelevant things that matter only to you and which don't justify your case, but you think they do. But they're not going to matter to me, because it doesn't matter to me if some group of people, some group of barbarians from Canaan or excuse me, from Israel had walked through reeds. And they're not correlated with the rest of the story, because we know that the rest of the stuff about Moses was taken from Sargon and Hammurabi. So we know that that's not historic. That doesn't change
not at all.
What?
From the stories, you keep making these claims, and I wish you could show me chapter and verse where they're taken from.
What chapter and verse, or what's taken from?
Of Sargon, for example, in a read.
Okay, I will. It's all in my book.
Because I know the same stories myself.
What?
And I know the same stories myself, and the Egyptologists, including, by the way, Aron Ross.
Why would you need me to give you citations if you already know them?
No. I want you to show me the relationship that you're arguing, that there's a relationship in the stories.
Okay, guys, I wonder.
Wait, 1 sec. Just even secular ones, non-Christians ones, will actually disagree with you on that.
Okay, and so Egyptologists and well, let me say archaeologists will actually agree with me.
No, they won't. They won't agree with DM's work. They will. That the whole notion that it's borrowed from Sargon and so on.
Yes, and biblical scholars do actually agree with me.
Name me one.
Okay. Let's see. Lloyd and Elizabeth Graham, as well. And I can build a list if you like.
What?
And I can cite them from my book. I mean, I have them here. I can pull up people that made the specific claims.
Lloyd Elizabeth Graham.
Lloyd and Elizabeth Graham. Yeah, that was just the first one that came up in there. Let's see, I'm looking for the title of the book on there. And I can give you a list of people who agree with me, if that matters. Of course, that's not going to be very compelling unless I give you the reasons why.
Yeah.
And it's the reasons why that I was giving you.
I'm talking legitimate scholars in that region, like, for example, James K. Hoffmeyer and Kenneth Kitchen and Finkelstein.
What do I need to do to give you a legitimate scholar in the region that you'll accept? I suspect that naming a name, and I'm going to say this is actually correct. I shouldn't give you a name of a person and then have the authority of that person change your mind. It wouldn't me. I would need to hear the reason that person changed their mind. I would need to hear what the evidence is. So asking me who the names are doesn't mean I can give you all the names.
And
you can make up a new excuse to dismiss each one of them.
That's why they use. Okay, Aron. That's why they use San Diego.
Have the evidence to
one sec, Aron.
I have the evidence to back what I'm saying. I can give you a list of biblical scholars and such who do agree with me.
Aron.
And I can give you the reasons that they do.
That's why the UC San Diego 2013 Exodus Conference had 40+ scholars that did have skeptical doubts about the Exodus, and they changed their mind because of the evidence.
Okay, let me look that up again. What was it? 2013. Give me the title again.
SC conference.
UTSC conference.
UC, University of California.
Hey, guys, I think maybe we can continue this tomorrow. I think it's about time to wrap it up, because we're kind of circling back to the previous topics.
Yeah, and the funny thing is he and I can agree on all the data, and he just comes to a completely different interpretation and says that it's absolutely consistent, where I say it's absolutely contradictory. And we're not going to make that impasse by him saying it's consistent and me saying it's bollocks.
Well, at least I presented the
data. It doesn't matter, because I have to prove that.
Well, okay, guys. So okay, here's what we're going to do now. I'm going to have you guys do closing statements. You can do a couple minutes, 2-3 minutes, not too long. I'll have General go first, and we'll give Aron the last word. Go ahead, General.
Okay. The reason why I believe the text is because I look at it as an actual historical document. I hate seeing it as a quote-unquote religious text. There's claims made. It's written in an ancient Near Eastern context. It beautifully matches the descriptions in the ancient Near East. There's no... If there was contradictions with the ancient Near East, I would have a problem with that. There's no contradictions. And at the same time, through divine agency, you have...
There are contradictions. I'm sorry. It's your close. I just couldn't help that. I'm sorry.
It's all right. It's all right.
I didn't mean to step out of line. There you go. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Robert.
And in divine providence of Theon Eustos, the inspired manner of the way the text was written, I believe Moses was the one who compiled Genesis, and obviously he recounted Exodus and so on. It completely concords with modern science, and so therefore I think Christians ought to allow science to be science and allow the scriptures to be what the scriptures are.
Okay, thank you, Robert. And Aron, go ahead.
The wealth of contradictions throughout the scripture, which could not have been composed by Moses, who evidently did not exist. But even if he did exist, he couldn't have written Genesis, and we know where Genesis came from, and it was way older than Moses. It's a compilation of other legends and mythos from other religions, and the reason that the Bible goes against history and goes against science, and goes against virtually everything else. I mean, the reason that the Bible is absolutely wrong about absolutely everything is because it was written by ignorant and bigoted savages who obviously had no idea what they were talking about at any point.
Okay, thanks. Aron, I want to thank you especially for being here. I know you're a really busy person currently running for Texas State Senate, and I'm glad that you took the time to be here because I think this debate, I think it went great. Robert, thank you as well. Aron, I've been watching your videos for a while. I especially like the foundational falsehoods of creationism. I saw them a few years ago. I remember thinking, man, this guy's a great voice for videos, and especially the way you do the graphics and everything. So yeah, I appreciate a lot of your work. So I kind of reflect what General said there. And I also want to thank the audience for being here. We had a pretty big live audience today, bigger than usual. Tomorrow, we are going to Aron Raw will be with Atheist Edge, and they will be on Steve McRae's channel, and it'll be more open, so we'll have more people in there. So if any of you guys want to come in and talk to Aron, it'll be up to Steve McRae who comes in. But hopefully we can get a few people and a few more voices. And right after this, I think someone from the Great Debate community is going to host an after show. I don't know if Aron won't be there because I think he has things to do or something, but I might, Robert might. So if you guys want to come to that, check the GDC. And okay, we're going offline now. Thanks a lot for listening, guys.